Hello friends, good afternoon and welcome to DSET Live Lectures. Dear friends, today in Political Science we will talk about India's security discourse and nuclear weapons. To discuss this topic we have with us our subject expert Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Dr. Jha is Associate Professor in Department of Political Science in Arambhatta College, University of Delhi. Without further ado, I would like to welcome sir to our studios and request him to start the lecture. Welcome sir.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Today's lecture we are going to devote on India's security discourse and the question of nuclear weapons. In fact, this theme itself is very important from the point of view of India's foreign policy as well as from the point of view of national security and so on and so forth. Now, the moment we talk about security discourse, in fact, security implies 3-4 important things in today's context. It can imply territorial security, it can also imply economic security along with the technological security in fast changing global world today. So therefore, in fact, this question of nuclear weapons or nuclear technology is associated with one can say all three to some extent, but most importantly with the question of technological security or security which can ensure both territorial safety, territorial integrity and a kind of and also ensure a robust economic development and other similar things. So therefore, the security is in fact a very broader concept in context of nuclear technology. Now, of course, the notion of security is fast changing in today's world. The way the notion of power is changing. In fact, there was a time when power in international relations was understood in terms of the military might of a nation, or the preparedness on front of army, navy, and air forces. But gradually, this power also. The concept and the notion of power started changing, and power was also equated with economic development. That how much economic resources a country has mobilized. What is the status of economic development of a nation. So therefore, power instead of simply getting associated with military preparedness also came to be associated with economic development and economic resources. And then a time came when along with this economic development and military preparedness, power also got equated with technological know-how, or one can say that possession of modern technology, particularly in terms of research and development. So therefore, the way power has undergone changes, the notion of power. Similarly, the notion of security has also been undergoing changes over the time. For example, it is not simply a territorial security which is paramount in the minds of a nation. Rather, along with territorial security, we also have to take into account the economic security, the kind of well-being, economic well-being of the citizens, and at the same time we also have to take into account the technological know-how in possession of a nation, and therefore that can also be very important factor so far as this entire discourse on security is concerned. Now, in fact, on all these three issues, if you look at from India's point of view, then we find that India has been particularly grappling with the two issues in a big way, particularly in the last 7 decades, particularly after India's independence. One is the economic security. Of course, the territorial security has always been important, and India has always been concerned with that. But two issues have had a global ramifications. One was the economic security, another was the technological security. Economic security in terms of attaining development, in terms of attaining economic growth, and in terms of ensuring possession of technological know-how. So what we find that India's security concern therefore has over the years been going from this economic and technological at the national level to a global terrain, global plane, in the sense that India's engagement with the global community has always been on these two issues, and very prominently done by India's leaders and India's policy makers. What happened that this entire engagement on the question of economic security, particularly in terms of development, was basically done through the framework of non-aligned movement and non-aligned politics, which India of course was the leader of this movement from its inception. But so far as this technological question of technology was concerned, it was basically India confronted a denial regime, technology denial regime imposed by the global community at the very beginning, particularly after India became independent and had to engage with the larger world community. And the best indication of this global technological denial regime can be seen through the prism of 4-5 important global treaties, or basically global measures which were initiated by the world community. For example, Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968, Nuclear Supplier Group which was created in 1974. In fact, it had a different context because NSG came into existence due to India's nuclear test in Pokhran in 1974, that is known as Pokhran 1. Then Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, Fissile Material Cut Treaty, and then MTCR, Missile Technology Control Regime. All these are basically the symbols, the marker of this technology denial regime imposed by the global community. Similarly, India also had to engage the global community so far as the economic security is concerned, particularly in terms of development. That was basically done through the demand for new international economic order. So therefore, what we find that on both fronts, India was engaging the larger global community, and therefore India's position on all these issues is important, both from the point of view of India's security as well as from the point of view of the world global politics. Now, what we find that in this context, we have to see India's nuclear discourse, that how one can make sense of India's nuclear discourse. One thing we should remember, that India has gone for 2 nuclear tests, 74 and 98, both in Pokhran. One is known as Pokhran 1 and another is known as Pokhran 2. India going for nuclear test in 74 had a definite context, and similarly 1998 one cannot basically dissociate from the 74, but at the same time one cannot dissociate from 2 important set of factors, one regional, another global. The regional because 2 of India's neighbors, one China who became nuclear power in 64, just much immediately before Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty came into existence in 68, and another neighbor who was rumored to be possessing nuclear weapons in a very clandestine manner with the help of China. So therefore, this regional security environment basically propelled India to think in terms of nuclear capability in order to ensure its territorial and national security. But when we look at India's nuclear discourse, we have to see it from the point of view of 4-5 different set of factors which are basically responsible, or one can say that which have influenced India's nuclear discourse over for last 6-7 decades. Now, what are those 5 factors? The first factor is the moral positioning which India has basically done on this question of armament, arm race, and global disarmament. Now, this moral positioning is to be seen in terms of India's inclination or desire for a global disarmament. India never believes in arms race or arms control, but India from the very beginning has been arguing for global disarmament, both through non-aligned movement as well as in bilateral or multilateral forums. Wherever India has got opportunity, India has argued for global disarmament. In fact, there was a time when non-aligned movement under India's leadership were positing basically development against arms race, development against entire military preparedness of the superpowers. So therefore, armaments, an arm industry or military industrial complex as it came to be known, particularly in advanced capitalist societies, India basically thought that it was basically wastage of resources, and particularly developing countries like India didn't have to do all those things, because what was more important and urgent for these nations was economic development, was economic growth, was economic security of the people, the livelihood of the people, and therefore the resources had to be optimally used for basically welfare of the masses, for feeding them instead of creating arms and armaments for war. So therefore, peace, development, progress, all these things were basically the buzzwords so far as India's global engagement was concerned. And therefore, this moral positioning so far as nuclear question is concerned, India has not abandoned even after India declared itself a nuclear power, particularly after 1998, after this weaponization program was completed, after the second test in Pokhran. Because what had happened, that India for the first time came out with a nuclear doctrine, and that doctrine included many things which we will discuss later, but one important component of that doctrine was that India would strive for global disarmament, and India also said that India would be the first country to destroy its nuclear capability if other nations of the world were ready to do that. And therefore, India's opposition to nuclear non-proliferation treaty of 1968 is also ethical and moral. It is not simply that India was denied this privilege to go for nuclear weapons through test and other things after this treaty came into existence, but India also thought that this NPT was nuclear non-proliferation treaty was unethical, because instead of destroying or declaring nuclear weapons illegitimate, what this treaty was all about was to create a world between two groups, nuclear haves and nuclear have-nots. Rather, it was going to basically check only a vertical proliferation, not horizontal proliferation, and therefore it basically opposed this treaty and didn't sign it till the end, and therefore its opposition of nuclear to nuclear non-proliferation treaty has been ethical, moral, and this moral positioning therefore one can see from the very beginning. In fact, we will come to this question later, that how India's first Prime Minister Nehru, whose imprint on India's foreign policy is quite significant. Of course, subsequent prime ministers have equally played important roles so far as India's security discourse is concerned, be it Mrs. Indira Gandhi, or subsequently Rajiv Gandhi, or perhaps the Narasimha Rao, and Atal Bihari Vajpayee, during whose premiership second Pokhran took place in 1998, and of course this Manmohan Singh, when civil nuclear deal with the US was basically cemented in 2005. So therefore, what we find that all these prime ministers, and let us not forget to mention Shastri and many and other prime ministers who perhaps played their own role so far as India's security discourse is concerned, to the present prime minister, who is also basically trying to engage global community, Narendra Modi, particularly in terms of India's membership in national nuclear supplier group, NSG. So therefore, all these prime ministers, because one thing we should remember, that foreign policy is one area which basically functions on basis of national consensus, in spite of ideological differences, in spite of domestic compulsions of different political parties in democracy. In fact, on foreign policy issues we find broadly a national consensus, and that is best reflected on the question of India's nuclear technology and nuclear capability. So much so that left parties, who at one point of time were opposed to India's nuclear policy, in the sense that India should not divert its resources towards acquiring nuclear weapons. But interestingly, in 2005, when it was opposing this US India civil nuclear deal, one of the basis on which it was opposing was also this, that it will be basically intrusion of United States in our nuclear capability, or one's internal matters, and secondly, this may hamper in future the prospect of going for another test. to basically update and enrich our capability. So, what I am basically trying to argue here, that in spite of earlier reservations, in spite of some moral ethical reservations on the question of nuclear weapons, we find that most of the political parties agree on this point of view, that in today's global context, this nuclear capability is important for India because of regional security environment, particularly in light of China's nuclear capability, and subsequently one can also mention Pakistan, because Pakistan has also become a nuclear power. So, therefore, this there is a national consensus, but this moral positioning, India's moral positioning on this nuclear question has been very consistent from the very beginning, and that is why I mentioned that when it came out with its nuclear doctrine, it did not abandon its moral dimension, moral positioning, because it mentioned that in spite of having nuclear capability, India still stands for global disarmament. The second, in fact, factor which has been very much prominent in India's nuclear discourse is the regional security environment, which I basically alluded earlier also. And this regional security environment has to be seen in terms of basically China and Pakistan's nuclear arsenals. Particularly China is important, because one should not forget that how 1962 India was basically humiliated through this Chinese aggression of 1962, which had a basically shattering, which shattered Pandit Nehru, who was believer in global peace, who was perhaps a great supporter of China so far as Security Council membership was concerned. In fact, he believed in Asian solidarity, but the way Chinese aggression took place, in fact, it came as a big blow to Nehru. Many scholars argue that perhaps he couldn't survive this shock, because after 2 years of Chinese aggression he also died. But what happened, that it was a wake up call to Indian policy makers, and therefore what happens that immediately when partial test ban treaty was basically mooted, India not only signed it, but became an ardent supporter of partial test ban treaty, because India thought perhaps it would be able to rein in China, because at that time China was a great threat to India's security after 1962. In fact, I will mention this dimension little later also, particularly in context of Shastri, because how Lal Bahadur Shastri, as successor of India, successor of Nehru, tried to secure a guarantee from the superpowers, particularly United States of America, Soviet Union and Britain, so far as India's security was concerned. But what we find, that when he discovered that security was not forthcoming, particularly after 1965, when Pakistan started going closer to United States, US coming for India's rescue was totally ruled out. So, therefore, 2-3 strategies he worked on, Shastri, but one of the important factor what I am trying to mention, that China's nuclear capability has always been very important for India's nuclear discourse. So, therefore, 64 China going nuclear, then partial test ban treaty, India basically believing that it may be able to rein in China, when all these things perhaps didn't materialize, and when Shastri's entire endeavor to secure basically a security guarantee from United States of America, Soviet Union, the two superpowers, and Britain didn't also fructify, what we find that India gradually started focusing on its nuclear research, which it was doing earlier also. I am basically turning to this issue, that how Nehru and Homi Bhabha, the two architects of India's nuclear discourse in the beginning, how they were focusing on research, but of course, the fact of the matter is that this research was geared essentially towards peaceful purposes. It was geared towards basically energy security. It was geared towards its use for medicine and other areas. It was never thought in terms of either a currency for power or in terms of a weaponization program. But nonetheless, this in fact this type of development which took place in mid 60s, that China testing nuclear weapons in 64, just immediately 4 years before the nuclear non-proliferation treaty came into existence, and then creation of NPT, because India was also thinking in terms of a multilateral framework like NPT, which would be basically a kind of preventive measure or which will be a kind of deterrence, or which will basically give some sort of sense of security to vulnerable nations like India. But when NPT came, and the way and in the form in which it came, it was highly disappointing for countries like India. So therefore, NPT India thought a kind of India believed that it was shortchanged. India believed that NPT was a mechanism by the dominant powers to divide the world between nuclear haves and nuclear have nots, and therefore India refused to sign it. So therefore, this regional security environment was a very important factor, and that is why one can see that how after 62 India gradually moved in direction of more intense research, and particularly the way the Indian state basically tried to support and develop both research and development so far as the nuclear technology is concerned, resulting into 1974 Pokhran 1. So therefore, the second important factor has been the regional security environment. The third important factor is the energy security, and it is equally important, because one should know that energy, what are the sources of energy in India. And here I would like to mention that there are three important sources of energy in India. One is of course the thermal energy, and which is perhaps the major source of energy, that is around 71.6% of the total consumption. Then you have the hydro energy, which is 26.7% of the total consumption. Then of course you have the non-conventional energies, and lot of research and lot of resources are also pumped into that area. And the third important source of energy in today's world is the nuclear energy, and it is believed today after this US-India civil nuclear deal and other measures which India has taken, and the kind of resources which it is basically spending on nuclear research, it is believed that 15 to 60% would be generated in next 25 years. So therefore, this energy is an important factor behind this India's nuclear discourse, because without energy development is not possible, and if India is really aspiring to be a global power, then two things are important: development and commensurate with that development, India's energy security, because it can't be totally dependent on oil and other things which are mostly imported. So therefore, this thermal, hydro, and basically another source of course is the oil energy, which is imported mostly from the Gulf countries and some other friendly nations. So therefore, this energy dimension is equally important in India's nuclear discourse, that how nuclear energy, which is considered to be a cleaner energy compared to coal and other things, petrocarbons, and it is believed that it will have lesser impact on climate, and therefore if India acquires nuclear technology, it will also ensure energy security, as well as it will also perhaps be more congenial for atmosphere and climate. So therefore, this third important aspect or dimension of India's energy nuclear discourse is this energy factor. Similarly, the fourth factor, which is also important and related to this technological dimension of nuclear question, is the medicinal use of nuclear technology, because lot of diseases, particularly in terms of its the research in terms of its curative, preventive and other measures are related to nuclear technology, particularly in cancer and other related diseases. So therefore, it is not simply security, it is not simply energy, but also medicine and health related dimension of this technology is equally important. And then of course, the fifth, which is basically not to be undermined at all, is the how nuclear technology or nuclear power capability in today's world is in fact a currency for global power, because today's world, two things are important: the economic development and technological position of advanced and modern technology. Unless a nation state has both, it cannot command respect in the global community, and therefore from the technology point of view, nuclear capability is very important factor. And one can find illustration of this point, this issue in the way the big powers and the superpowers have started basically placating India after India's nuclear test in Pokhran 1998. The civil nuclear deal of course had certain other context also, particularly growing anxiety in USA about the rise, about China and China's ascendancy in Asia and on global stage, and therefore looking at India as a potential checkmater or a potential power which can checkmate China. But apart from that, one thing should not be completely lost sight of, that India, after acquiring nuclear capability, in fact many scholars say that India is still not a de jure nuclear power, but de facto nuclear power. De jure because after this NPT, those countries who have not signed it, or those countries who had acquired nuclear weapons before 68 are only de jure nuclear power, and all other countries are basically prohibited. Rather, there is a prescription that you cannot acquire it, but India defied it. India had not signed it, therefore no moral binding to go for nuclear test, and India used that opportunity to test it 2 times in Pokhran in 74 and 98. But after 98, when it went for a weaponization program and came out with a nuclear doctrine, one finds a different type of approach of the global community towards India. So much so that initial sanctions which were imposed by United States of America and many countries, those sanctions were gradually lifted. NSG Nuclear Supplier Group, which was created in 1974 after Pokhran 1, just to basically ensure denial of this technology to country like India. In fact, the same NSG gave waiver in 2008 for nuclear trade and commerce, and it allowed different countries of the world to do trade and commerce without having any restriction, because India was not a signatory to NPT, but still they were doing trade and commerce. So what we find that this third, the fifth dimension, that it is definitely a power, symbol of power, and it is a currency for power in today's world, is best reflected in this reaction of this great powers in today's context. So therefore, India's nuclear discourse has to be seen from the point of view of these 5 different set of factors, that how they have propelled India to basically go nuclear, or basically formulate a nuclear policy so far as its security discourse is concerned. Of course, how it has happened, there is a historical context of it, and there is a context of the political context in terms of the role various prime ministers have played. So in fact, those things are also important while understanding this question of India's security discourse. India's security discourse and the question of nuclear weapons, as we have seen, is to be seen from the point of view of 2-3 interrelated set of factors. The first, that how India had to confront a global technology denial regime, and how India maneuvered its way in spite of such a technology denial regime in place, and India's compulsion for acquiring modern technology in order to attain economic development and at the same time for ensuring its territorial and national security. So, this entire thing is quite interesting, that how India has maneuvered its way over these years. And the best example of that is perhaps that in today's world we find that in spite of the fact that India is not a signatory to Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of 68, but still India tested nuclear weapons in 98 on certain premises, and those premises are very moral, because India, as I mentioned earlier, also has been advocating global disarmament. India is not a great votary or great supporter of nuclear weapons, but India argues that till the time the entire world has a right to possess nuclear weapons, India also has a similar right, and it cannot basically tolerate any world order where you have a kind of division between the nuclear haves and nuclear have-nots, and India as a developing country being pushed into the second category as nuclear have-nots. So, therefore, that is a kind of moral positioning, and then using it, it has tried to basically use its own indigenous resources, its own technological know-how, in spite of completely the global support dried up. In fact, the countries were pressurized after the formation of nuclear supplier group in 1974 to not do any trade and commerce with India, particularly on nuclear materials, nuclear technology, but still India went ahead and basically acquired a kind of capability which is really commendable, and therefore, we have to see that how India did it. And the architect of this discourse, particularly architect of this entire policy, in fact is India's first Prime Minister Nehru and his nuclear advisor Bhabha, Homi Bhabha, and therefore, at times it is referred to as Nehru-Bhabha discourse on nuclear question in India. Now, Homi Bhabha was a nuclear physicist, and he was a very respected scientist in the on the global stage. So much so that when Atom for Peace conference was held by the United Nations, it was Homi Bhabha who became who became its president. This conference, UN Conference on Peaceful Uses of Atomic Energy, was held in Geneva in 1955, and Bhabha was its president. So, therefore, one can get some idea about his stature, and he was one of the architect of India's nuclear policy along with Nehru. So, this Nehru-Homi Bhabha or Nehru-Bhabha discourse on this nuclear question was basically geared towards two-pronged missions. One was for energy security, another was for peaceful uses, that how it will be meant for peaceful usages. Peaceful means that it will be used for development, not for armaments. Now, what happened that what we have to see that in this period, this Nehru-Bhabha period, we find that a lot of institutions were set up in India, and the most important institution which was set up in India was India Atomic Energy Commission in 1948. The second important institution which was created was the Department of Atomic Energy in 1954. The third important, of course, was the Defense and Science Advisory Board. So, therefore, what we find that a very robust research and development program was put in place, in fact, but with a very noble purpose that it will be used for peaceful purposes. So, therefore, what we find that during this period, Nehru-Bhabha period, we find that India was moving solidly in terms of research and development towards basically acquiring nuclear technology, or one can say nuclear know-how. Of course, it was a different world altogether. It was a post Second World War world which was basically in the grip of Cold War, particularly between the two superpowers, and the two superpowers who were basically locked in arms race were also putting forth different proposals. For example, the best example of this is to be seen in terms of United States proposal which was that Baruch plan, and similarly the Soviet Union had also proposed similar things earlier. So, what happened? The superpowers had own sets of proposals, they had own engagement between the two superpowers, continuously engagement was going on armed control and disarmament. But the third world countries who did not have any say in this entire discourse was basically to some extent one can say that it was channelized through only countries like India, particularly when non-aligned movement took up this issue of disarmament and demand for new international economic order. So, what happened that we find that this Nehru-Bhabha period therefore was characterized by two important things: setting up of institutions of high caliber so far as the nuclear research and development is concerned, and number two, at the global forum, on the global stage, a continuous basically advocacy for global disarmament. Now, what happens that Nehru, as India's first Prime Minister, and Bhabha was his advisor or a close collaborator, Nehru on this question of nuclear weapons or nuclear technology had also certain very solid positions, or one can say that Nehru also had stated that he was opposed to arms race, he was opposed to nuclear weapons, and he wanted only technology to be used for peaceful purposes and for development. So, of course, his moral idealism which is well known for the experts and students of international relations and foreign policy. But nonetheless, one thing is very important, that along with taking this moral along with doing this moral posturing, Nehru also basically moved in direction of self-reliance, whether it was mining or enrichment of reactors or separation of plutonium from spent fuel. All these were being done with indigenous research, and the kind of efficiency and proficiency with which Indian scientists were basically accomplishing this task is something very commendable. So, therefore, what we find that during this period, on the one hand, this institutional network was being put in place. On the other hand, research know-how was actively promoted and supported by India's first Prime Minister and his nuclear advisor Homi Bhabha. Now, of course, so far as this nuclear technology is concerned, India's nuclear technology, Homi Bhabha had 3 stage plan for its development, and that is very significant to remember. That what were those 3 stages? Knowing the fact that India had certain limitation in natural resources, particularly in terms of India's abundance in the thorium, not in uranium and plutonium. What Bhabha had proposed and what Bhabha was basically advocating, or what he had implemented, the roadmap he had given, was a 3-stage development of nuclear technology. First was that pressurized heavy water uranium based reactor. The second was the plutonium based fast breeder reactor. The third was the thorium based reactor, and he thought that the third stage, that is the thorium based reactor, would basically ensure India's self-reliance in this field, because there was abundance of thorium in India. So, therefore, what we find that Bhabha had these 3-pronged strategy so far as the development and fabrication of nuclear technology is concerned. So, all these things were going on, but one thing should be remembered, that in the meanwhile 1962 was a turning point, as I mentioned earlier also, because India on the one hand was focusing on global disarmament, it was using nuclear technology for peaceful purposes, it was supporting its research and development through indigenous resources and through indigenous know-how because of this technology denial regime which was put in place. In the meanwhile, 1962, this Chinese aggression was a turning point so far as India's entire nuclear discourse is concerned and India's security discourse is concerned, because China's aggression of 1962 had basically far-reaching implications for India's security. It is for the first time that India realized that its security was vulnerable, and therefore it had to focus on its security needs. Now, Nehru's moralism also got shattered, and therefore, as I mentioned earlier, that Nehru could not perhaps basically tolerate, or one can say that could not digest the humiliation of 62, and after 2 years of course Nehru also died. Nehru was succeeded by Lal Bahadur Shastri. Now Shastri's tenure is marked by kind of ambivalence so far as India's nuclear discourse is concerned, because one thing is very important, that Shastri was quite worried about India's security. In fact, India's security therefore in hands of Shastri has to be seen in terms of three-pronged strategy. The first was, as I mentioned earlier also, that he wanted a security guarantee from the two superpowers as well as Britain, but in fact particularly vis-a-vis China, which was basically not forthcoming. The second, he wanted a multilateral solution, something in form of nuclear non-proliferation treaty. It happened, but it was far below India's expectation. Then Shastri also wanted a kind of ban on subterranean nuclear explosion, and in fact, so all these measures were basically China centric, because at that time India's prime preoccupation was to basically ensure security vis-a-vis China, because 1964 China had tested its nuclear capability. Immediately 4 years, 4 years before the nuclear non-proliferation treaty came into existence, and it declared itself to be a nuclear power, and therefore was ready to sign NPT as a nuclear power. And basically that was a kind of a wake up call for India, because India's neighbor, who had basically undertaken an aggression in 62, suddenly became a nuclear power and was basically part of a global arrangement which was discriminatory and which was basically trying to prevent countries like India to go nuclear in future. So therefore we find that 1962 was a turning point. Then of course after 1962 we find that this nuclear non-proliferation treaty comes into existence. In between, of course, we have partial test ban treaty in 1963. India thought that it will have some sort of a preventive impact on China, but it didn't stop China from going nuclear, because 64 it acquired that capability. And then what we find that India's entire nuclear discourse now is entering into new phase, in the post Nehru Bhabha phase, where initially this Bikram Sarabhai, who succeeded Bhabha, was reluctant for a weaponization program, but the Indian scientists at their own were continuously moving in that direction. In the meanwhile, we find that Shastri's succession took place, and it was Mrs. Indira Gandhi who became India's prime minister, and lot of changes started taking place in India's foreign policy, including the entire radicalization of non-aligned movement in her hands, when it became anti-West. Because one thing we should remember, that along with 1962 this Chinese aggression, India fought another war in 1965 with Pakistan, and after 1965 Pakistan started, United States started tilting heavily towards Pakistan, and gradually we find that a new triangle, a strategic triangle was created in South Asia, that was US, China and Pakistan after US, China death. So therefore we find that India had now very few options, and India had to ensure two things, its nuclear research and nuclear capability to ensure its security, and on basis of its indigenous resources and indigenous research. Of course, there were some countries who were initially cooperating or supporting, like France, Canada, Britain, but later on we find that after this nuclear supplier group came into existence in 1974, all these supports were getting dried up, and Soviet Union, who became friendly after this after particular 1971 on friendship, peace and friendship treaty, but nonetheless in fact there were serious, or one can say that there were many limitations under which both countries have to operate so far as nuclear trade and commerce is concerned. So it is in this context that India moves in direction of its first nuclear test in 1974, that is Pokhran 1. And interestingly, Pokhran 1 is referred as as a Buddha smiles, because Buddha is a symbol of peace, and Pokhran 1 was basically not meant for arms race, it was not meant for weaponization, but Pokhran 1 was essentially meant for nuclear capability for peaceful purposes, because even till 74 India had not thought in terms of going nuclear in terms of weaponization program. So, therefore, 1974 happens, and that is basically another landmark so far as India's security discourse and the nuclear discourse is concerned. Now, we have two Pokhrans, Pokhran 1 and Pokhran 2, and both are equally significant, because what happens that Pokhran 2 of course happens much later. In fact, both are separated by 24 years, 74 and 98. So, therefore, what we find that after 24 years you have another nuclear test in Pokhran, that is 98, of course under a different Prime Minister Bajpayee, who represented a political party who from the very beginning was supportive of India's nuclear weapons program. He was his party, which is now BJP, but earlier it was Bharatiya Janasangh, had also supported Pokhran 1 when Mrs. Indira Gandhi had tested nuclear capability, because from the very beginning ideologically this party was for nuclear weapons and nuclear capability as basically a marker for dignity and status for a nation in on the global stage. So, therefore, 98 had a different context from 1974. Of course, 98 has a context in terms of the end of Cold War, whereas the 74 had a context of Cold War, because 74 the first nuclear test happened in the heyday of Cold War politics, but 98 happened in the post Cold War period. Now, there are 2-3 things important to remember, that 98, before 98 what happened, that India's maneuverability was getting diminished, particularly end of Cold War. After the Gulf War of 1990, when United States led a new arrangement was put in place, and it had many facades, or it had many ramifications in economy, in politics, and so on and so forth. United Nations Security Council had a summit level meeting in 1992, and Narasimha Rao was Prime Minister. It was a historic resolution which was taken there. Of course, India had no legal obligation or moral obligation under Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was holding its back. But of course, it was a resolution particularly directed toward those countries which were considered threshold countries like India, who had the capability or who were basically moving in direction of nuclear capability. So, therefore, what happened that this signaled a new period in global politics, where these 5 countries who were nuclear power, which is known as Group of 5, they were not going to allow any fresh entrant into this club, that is the nuclear club. So, therefore, India was in for a very difficult time when India's research was growing very fast. India's scientists were basically moving in direction of acquiring this capability very soon. On the other hand, there was a global pressure, and one should not forget that India's economy was also undergoing major transformation due to economic reforms. India was heavily dependent on International Monetary Fund and World Bank, and particularly the support from the Western powers. It was a very difficult time in which India had to basically negotiate its way, and all credit to India's Prime Minister in this period, Narasimha Rao, who basically tried to buy time with the Western powers, particularly on the question of nuclear weapons and similar other issues. In fact, one of the experts of international relations in India's foreign policy has characterized this dialogue between Rao and the Western powers like United States of America as dialogue of deifs, because both were trying to put forth their one point of view without listening to the other. So, this dialogue of deifs continued till 95, when India was very close to testing its nuclear capability, but suddenly United States of America got some hints, and therefore it brought pressure and it was shelved. But finally, after 3 years in 1998, what we find that during Atal Bihari Vajpayee's premiership, India tested its nuclear capability in 1998 in Pokhran. That is Pokhran 2. Of course, it invited a lot of sanctions, and as I mentioned that those sanctions were gradually also lifted there was a context of the lifting of those sanctions, particularly the China factor, which played in the minds of the American interlocutors and policy makers. But at the same time, the most significant factor was 2005 civil nuclear deal between India and United States of America.
I'm sorry, sir, I have to stop you here, but
Yeah.
we have a question.
Yeah.
Please state your name and ask your question.
Hello, ma'am.
Hanji, please.
Hello, sir.
Yeah. Hello.
Sir, my name is Pavangiri
Yeah.
and I am calling from Varanasi.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Sir, can I do my question?
Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
Sir, today India has a great threat from China and Pakistan.
Right.
Okay, sir.
Mm-hmm.
Hello.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm listening to you. Yes.
Yes, sir.
From
India
China and
has
Pakistan.
great
Yeah.
threat from China and Pakistan.
Yes.
So why we could not develop hydrogen bomb to tackle the threat of India and Pakistan? And so what was the challenges ahead to develop hydrogen bomb?
So your question is that why India is not going for hydrogen bomb?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
In fact, as I was mentioning earlier also, that India's entire security discourse is very nuanced. It is not very simple that our neighbor or our adversary has this bomb, so therefore we should fabricate another matching bomb. It is very nuanced thing, and India has to basically ensure two things together. First, its security; it should not get exposed, or it should not remain vulnerable to any adversary's intervention. Number two, that it cannot afford to divert entire resources for armaments and arms race, because development is equally important for India. Because of course nuclear weapons is a currency for global power, no one denies it today. But at the same time, you should also remember that in today's world, only those countries and their voice is heard which has a very sturdy economic growth, or where economic resources are in abundance, and largely on account of economic development. Why China all on a sudden? In China has been nuclear power since 64, but why in last 2 decades China's prominence has grown in the world, on the world stage? Largely because of its economic development. So for India, therefore, has to balance the two things, right? Of course, India is very conscious about the fact that China and Pakistan both are nuclear power, particularly China, whose capability is far greater than Pakistan. But nonetheless, India cannot afford to pump in entire resources on armaments at the cost of its development. So therefore, you have to understand this question this way.
I hope this answers your question, and for that note, thank you for asking your question. So please.
Yeah. So therefore, what I was mentioning, that 2005, the civil nuclear deal between India and United States of America is a very important landmark so far as India's nuclear discourse is concerned, because of 2-3 reasons. Because what was happening earlier has been called as a nuclear apartheid by scholars, because these countries who had not signed nuclear non-proliferation treaty were barred from global trade and commerce. In fact, countries were not allowed to do any trade and commerce with these countries. And NSG, as I mentioned, nuclear supplier group, was created in 74 precisely because of India after Pokhran 1. But what this India's US civil nuclear deal signaled, that in spite of India not having signed NPT, but still India's credential as a responsible nation, as a democratic nation, its track record as a country which has not allowed any proliferation and or particularly illegal spread of nuclear technology, these countries decided that India should be basically brought in the company of these Western powers or many other powers who are nuclear powers, and India's position should be utilized to basically check nuclear proliferation in the world. So instead of isolating in India, it was decided that if India is basically taken on board, it will be perhaps much more important. Because what happened after Pokhran 2, India basically came out its nuclear doctrine for the first time. What was India's nuclear doctrine? First was minimum credible deterrence. Second was no first use. It will not use nuclear weapons in the first place. It will use only after it is attacked with nuclear weapons. And third, that was the moral, ethical position, that it will work for global disarmament. And then the fourth, equally important, that in spite of the fact that it had not signed nuclear non-proliferation treaty, it went for a self-imposed moratorium. that it will not go for another test. Of course, there was a lot of debate on this, but nonetheless this was very important. So, what happened that in this context India US civil nuclear deal is basically done in 2005. Two important acts are normally mentioned in this context: the Hyde Act of 2008 and the 123 agreement with the USA, because USA has the Atomic Energy Act of 1954 and 123 is one clause of that act. So, therefore, Hyde Act, which was enabling act, which enabled the American president to basically waive all restrictive measures so far as nuclear trade and commerce is concerned with India, and 123 agreement basically allowed United States of America to do trade and commerce in nuclear technology, and subsequently International Atomic Energy Commission safeguard agreement was also put in place, and on basis of all these we find that 2008 nuclear supplier group gave waiver to India for nuclear trade and commerce. So, this is how India's entire thing has come of age. It has basically graduated from Nehru Bhabha discourse to a situation where India today is a de facto nuclear power, in spite of the fact it has not signed NPT, but still global powers, important countries of the world, they are keen to do trade and commerce with India. Of course, the debate is going on inside, but nonetheless it is very important that how India has basically secured its security, both technological, energy and otherwise, through a very profound discourse on nuclear technology.
Dear friends, we hope that with today's lecture you were able to understand India's security discourse and nuclear weapons. On that note, we would like to thank Dr. Jha for coming here and delivering this wonderful lecture, and thank you dear friends watching our lecture. Stay tuned and keep watching. Thank you.